Hello and welcome to the latest video and podcast from Fantasy Football Scout as we once again meet a manager. Predicting Pep is turning into an art form, and this is particularly important in Game Week 20 when Manchester City have a double game week as they face Manchester United and Spurs. These Meet the Manager videos are designed to watch anytime you want, so just pretend there's any double game week. It's all important for Man City, but it happens to be Manchester United and Spurs this time around. Joining me to find out more about predicting Pep is Alex Michel, aka Man City lineup predictor at 4lex_MCFC on Twitter. Alex, how are you?
Hi, I'm great, Joe. How are you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm glad I got that Twitter handle out the way. It's better if people just look at it. They're not really designed to.
Is.
You're not designed to say these things. But yeah, it actually makes much more sense when you can see it there. The 4 is the A of Alex. Before we look at Man City and Game Week 20 and even about the work you do on Twitter in particular to try and help us FPL managers predict a Pep. It'd be good to find out a bit about you, about how you started playing FPL. And in the meantime, as we talk, I'll put a picture up of one of your recent tweets. This was for Game Week 19, looking ahead at Man City's starting odds for the players. So yeah, how did you start getting involved with FPL then?
Yeah, so I've grown up on the East Coast of the US all my life, and growing up, I played football, basketball, and baseball. Those were my three sports, and so football was always sort of very close and near and dear to me, but I didn't necessarily follow it until I was about, 11 or 12 years old. And then throughout high school here, before uni, with some friends, we started playing the FPL Draft League. And we did that for about 3 seasons. And I think in the second and third season of doing the draft league, I was curious and found out about actual FPL pretty much and the budget version of the game. And so I made a team there, but barely knew what I was doing. And then once I sort of got a bit more involved on Twitter, just consuming content that way, I sort of persuaded my friends to do a budget league instead of a draft league, and that's when things really kicked off. And then for about 2 seasons, I played it sort of fairly hardcore, but I would sort of always fall apart in the middle and stuff. Very much a learning process. And then it's really been the last 2 seasons where I've sort of ramped up my engagement with things, ramped up my involvement on Twitter, and that's where I'm at the moment. Yeah.
Right. So you're US based. You're based in Maryland, is it?
Maryland.
Yeah.
Yep, Maryland.
And it's unusual. How unusual is it for a young bloke in Maryland to be into FPL?
In terms of generally following football and following the Prem, not unusual at all. I have so many friends who follow it, but in terms of playing FPL, it's a very much more niche group. I have a core of about 5 or 6 friends, I would say, who range between fairly engaged to just as hardcore as I am. And so it is pretty unique. And every year we'll persuade, a group of 15 to 20 other friends who know a bit about football, watch it occasionally, to join our mini league and whatnot. But it really is a group of about 5 or 6 of us, of my close friends who really play FPL. So pretty unique, yeah.
I always like that because when you speak to people on the Meet the Manager show from around the world, and also they might have got into FPL at different times, perhaps when it was smaller as well. I just always find it interesting because, I mean, obviously here in the UK, it still feels niche. If I go into a pub or bar and it very rarely, once in 2 years, someone will either recognize me or will talk to me about FPL. And it's very rare. It's still quite niche, but there's still 11 million people that play it. So obviously growing. But yeah, I just found that interesting. So your track record so far, I mean, it's not great, but it's getting better. So for the past 3 seasons, you've hovered between the 200 and 400k mark. You've had a reasonable start this season, though, I would say. You're currently just under the 1 million mark, but you've been in the top 70k. So you're just sort of going up and down around there, which is a good point to be, because there's a lot of managers who are
Mhm.
like 4 million, 5 million, etc.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what are the reasons for that? I've got in my notes here that you mostly have bad starts, but I would say you've had quite a good start this season in relative terms.
Yeah, this season has been very different for me. I mean, the past 3 seasons that I've played, uh, I didn't really get off to the best start in any of them. I always ended up wildcarding around game week 3, 4, 5, pretty much. And so that definitely played a part as I would use that wildcard way too early because of some rash decisions, not really following the template with the initial wildcard. And then that sort of set me back a bit. And then it's really normally in this part of the season, this middle part of the season where the double game weeks start to come, that I would shoot up the ranks, get up to about 150k most seasons around that area, and then slowly tail off towards the end of the season. And then sprinkled in there are some rash decisions where, just real life gets in the way for a week. I sort of get a bit uh, just not really involved with FPL, not really feeling it. Maybe sometimes want to have a bit of fun with the game. Like I remember last season, I tried to be a bit too clever, and City were playing Burnley in game week 8 or 9, I think, and Pope was out, as well as having an injury or two to their back line. So they had backup Peacock Farrell in goal, and Mahrez was pretty much nailed on for a start that game. And with how triple captains had gone the 2 seasons before, of like we wait for double game weeks and then no one really does anything. Even then, I was like, let me take this opportunity and you know try put the triple captain on a nailed Mahrez against Burnley with the backup, and we beat them 7-0, I think, and Mahrez didn't get a single return. And then, of course, that's the season where everyone ends up going and triple captaining Salah and De Bruyne for 24 and 30 points, respectively.
Well, I wonder. I mean, with this time around, with Manchester City playing twice, and Mara's in good form. I wonder whether that you'll be tempted again,
Yeah,
or
I don't
others,
think so.
or others will. You've recently graduated from university. But are you looking to do more FPL content? I put some of your content up on the screen. We'll talk about that in a minute. But are you looking to sort of ramp that up at all?
Yeah, in a way. So pretty much, I started doing FPL content last summer when I was sort of bored one day when the Euros were on, the game had come out, I was tinkering with a wild card, and I wrote this like 3,000 word article essay pretty much, just sort of breaking down my thoughts about different price structures. And I sent it on Twitter, and Surya from All About FPL messaged me back within a few hours pretty much saying that he loved the piece. And that's why I started writing for All About FPL, which is
Okay.
absolutely amazing site. And um, I started writing for them, and then obviously I had my final year of uni and didn't really have the time to devote to it. And so with this season, it's really been the first time where I've sort of gone hardcore into creating content and whatnot. And
Okay.
so for me, it's difficult because I'm looking for a job within the football design world, trying to
Okay.
write, do photography and design for a club or organization in the long term. But I also love FPL and love creating content. So I'm sort of stuck in this middle ground where, I have the city predictions and threads and other stuff that I do that I can keep up consistently, even if I have a job. But then there's also the potential to expand things. So I'm sort of in a middle ground right now where things are a bit unclear as to where things are going.
You're part of Emma, who is Jump the Wave
Mhm.
on Twitter. She's been on the show, Meet the Manager. She sort of collected a lot of views from people like yourselves around team sheets, but particularly with Man City. Trying to
Mhm.
guess these lineups, looking at. And now it's expanded to a whole range of clubs and a whole range of people. And you're part of that sort of network as well. You're one of the Man City guys for her.
Yeah, I started predicting in game week 3 of this year. I reached out to her after I didn't know about it until this season, and so I reached out to her around game week 3, asked if I could start predicting. She added me in, and then just recently, actually around the restart, she'll always put out the sort of commentary for each of the clubs. And Quicksilva, who's on Twitter, who's an amazing guy, did the commentary in the first half of the season, but he had some other responsibilities taking over, so he passed over that to me, and
Okay.
so now I'm doing the commentary for that as well.
Okay. Should we talk? I mean, is there anything else you want to say around sort of your, what it's like being on Twitter doing this type of thing? But otherwise, we'll in a sec we'll get on to how you predict Pep.
Yeah, I mean, I think just one sort of general note is that, I'm 23 years old at the moment, turning 24 soon. And, I've only been doing Twitter consistently, doing content. I've been involved for a few years, but really only doing content for about the last year or so. And so I'm getting up there towards 10,000 followers at almost 8,500 right now. And the rise has been like pretty spectacular.
Well,
And so it's just been
people want
sort
to
of,
know the Man City lineup, don't they?
yeah. And so it's been sort of like shocking for myself, but at the same time, not, it makes sense. But sort of just to say to people out there that, if you are someone who's like really interested in FPL and has a yearning to make content in a way, it can seem really daunting to start off, but at the same time, it's just, if you start putting out content that people enjoy and people want to interact with and people find valuable,
Yeah.
then it doesn't matter, what age you are, how old you are, what gender you are, or whatever, just make that content and go for it. And if you do it and devote yourself to it, and if you're doing stuff that's valuable, then the following and interactions and the sort of gratification for that will come. So that's just something I wanted to say.
And podcasting as well.
Yeah.
Looking to start that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've done on Twitter, most notably along with predicting city lineups, is every now and then, typically about once a week or so, I'll put out a meta thread, which is pretty much relative to my team, whatever big idea I'm sort of thinking about at the moment. And I try to always curb those to be something that no one else is really talking about. Maybe like a sort of anecdote that you hear on a podcast that the FPL Wire guys or whatever or you yourself might note somewhere along the line, but people don't really go into detail of because we're so focused on these other things. And so I'm starting a podcast in about a month or so called the Meta FPL Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Meta FPL Pod. And it'll be primarily myself. Sometimes my good friend Anthony from home will be my co-host. And that'll pretty much be a podcast about these meta ideas. And then also including interviews of people from around the community who can come on and talk about a very specific part of the game. And so the idea of that is sort of in a way similar to the Meet the Manager series, but also involving a bit of more core strategy ideas where that, maybe it'll be 10, 15, 20 episodes long. The idea is just to put that out over the next year or so that over the coming years, anyone who gets involved in FPL can go and reference that podcast and it'll sort of always be relevant. It won't be that sort of typical game week to game week pod. It'll just be this sort of wide scoped, focusing on these meta ideas based on strategy and experience and whatnot.
Well, I hope it goes well. I mean, there is definitely a gap in that market because a lot of content we do, and as we're going to go on to it, the later part of this show is specific to a particular game week. But I mean, like with this show, we use that as a sort of a snapshot of your thinking, and they're sort of designed to look at any time. So any of these Meet the Manager videos, like what you were just talking about there, you can watch at any time. So yeah, and not many else do that. So I think you've got it's good for you to do that as well. And it's really handy for those who are veterans of the game but also new to it to have a better understanding of some of those strategies that we can use.
Yeah, that's the thought.
Okay, so you do a range of, because you're a graphic design by trade, so you do a lot of sort of graphics on, but around Man City, so we've got one up on screen at the moment. This was the Man City starting odds for game week 19, and as a way of trying to predict the Man City lineups. So I mean, looking at, you've got Ederson, De Bruyne, Haaland, Rodri, and Bernardo as almost undroppables at the moment. You've got Ake, Stones, Kanji, Cancelo, Mahrez in. They might get dropped, but they're probably safe. And then you've got these sort of 50-50s. Who knows? Foden, Grealish, Gundogan, Laporte, Walker, any of them could play or not play. Lewis as well is starting to get into that mix. Alvarez might not start, but he might come on. And then you've got the likes of Ortega, Palmer, Phillips, more of your cup guys at the moment. Phillips, obviously, he's got his current problems post-World Cup with eating too much, according to Pep Guardiola. But we might see him a bit more. But definitely Rodri's understudy.
Hmm.
But looking week to week, how do you come up with these odds? How do you decide which a player? What goes into that thought process?
Yeah. So throughout over the course of the week, there's always obviously the FPL deadline, and it's pretty much the night before the deadline is when I sit down and write this bed. Sometimes the day before, even depending on schedule. But sort of, I have that benchmark of I know when I have to get this out by. And up until then, throughout the week, I'll just sort of process things, process all the information that's coming out. It's really just taking in everything in terms of the context, looking at the tactical ideas that Pep has expressed recently and what changes there are. Right now we're in this sort of revolution of tactics from
Mm,
Pep at City. Uh, Taking into account that, taking into account obviously injuries, fitness, the sort of more tangible things, listening to Pep's press conferences and, trying to read things from him. Obviously, you can't just listen to his press conference and expect everything Pep to say to be true. But I've followed him and watched him enough over the few years where I can sort of read his body language in a
mm,
way and understand when he's sort of indicating to some things, or at other times just sort of put it aside and understand that what he's saying is completely useless. And so it's really just an influx of
mm.
all these things, trying to process them internally. Throughout the week, maybe once or twice, I'll sort of check in on my judgment, see how things are going, see what I would predict at the moment. Um, and then once I finally sit down and write the thread, pretty much how I do it is that the process goes that I'll sort of break things down first by position because typically under Pep, we've played this 4-3-3 in possession or 4-3-3 out of possession, my apologies. And then it transitions to something else in possession. And so I'll pretty much base everything around that in possession 4-3-3, which has been a bit more complicated
Yeah.
recently. But base everything around about the out of possession 4-4-3-3. Sort of break down who can play at each position, and then based on the tactical needs of the game, based on who's been rested recently, based on the comments, basically everything I've said, sort of try to come up with these percentages, these figures about how I personally feel the lineup will go.
Okay.
And then I sort of aggregate all those percentages together once I feel good about them on the formation side of things. And then I add them all up for the overall odds, which is what we see on the screen here. And then I sort of double check that, think maybe, oh, is this person's too high? Is this person's a bit too low? And then go back to the positions, see where that could have been wrong,
Okay.
and just sort of double check until I look at it and I think, yeah, that seems about right. And then the predicting the starting 11 is a bit different sometimes. It's not always going to be the first 11 highest odds. But that's why I also do these odds is because, a lot of people will put out a prediction and you can't really tell like how close the next person is to
Yeah.
getting in. And so that's why I started doing these odds. And I just feel like it gives a bit better understanding of like my perspective and how I'm
Yeah.
feeling about
Yeah. I mean, this
things.
sort of traffic light color coded system of doing that with the percentages is really, for someone like me, I like to keep things simple.
Hmm.
And I look at this and keeps it nice and simple for me. So I like
Yeah.
that. Which is why these posts are popular as well. So this it can be tricky though with Pep when you talk about his body language and how he talks about certain players as well. And last year it was a golden era for predicting Peppers because the likes of Cancelo played every game. Foden, he was nailed on every game. It would be just resting for another particular game, very rarely. You could pretty much predict most of the side.
Hmm.
This season, suddenly Cancelo's out of favour. Suddenly Foden is out of favour. He looks great though. Every time he plays for England, every time he played in the cup recently and scored. So what is it? How can you tell when a player has not just been dropped, but they've been, well, in Cancelo and Foden's game, just put in an ejector seat and set off into space?
Yeah, sometimes it even takes myself by surprise, Up until the restart, up until game week 17, I hadn't gotten worse than a 9 out of 11 prediction in the Premier League. And then in game week 17 and game week 18, I got 7 out of 11 in both of
Yeah.
those. So back-to-back worst performances of the season for me in terms of predicting. But, sometimes you just can't really blame it on anyone. Sometimes it just comes out of nowhere and we have to make sense of it, which is sort of what we're doing at the current moment. And so pretty much what's happened is that Pep has changed the system in possession, whereas in the beginning of the season, what would happen is that we would have a 2-3-5 pretty much, where we would have two center backs sitting deep. We would have Rodri holding in the middle, and you would have the two fullbacks pushing up alongside Rodri on either side of him about equally, with Cancelo being mostly the more attacking one, and then sometimes Gundogan or Bernardo dropping deep to fill in his space. And the issue that happened with that, and that has sort of been like a pain in Pep's ass pretty much for the entire time he's managed the Prem, is that against teams that sit back and try to counter us, that system can fall apart, and that we can be really susceptible to counters against teams like that. You know, Spurs, we have a terrible track record against because they just play that way. You know, we'll have 3 or 4 XG, and then they'll get 2 shots on the counter, and Son will score one of them. And so pretty much what Pep has done recently is that instead of that 2-3-5 formation, he switched it to a 3-2-5 formation, where he has 3 center backs in a back line, and then in front of them is Rodri alongside one other in a double pivot sort of. Okay. And the main change that's come of that is that no one can quite play that other DM position quite like Rico Lewis, which is quite astounding to say for an 18-year-old. Okay. You know, Phillips can play that now that he's getting back to fitness. Bernardo can play that like we saw against Chelsea in game week 19. Besides that, Pep is really out of options there, because Cancelo can't really play that because he doesn't have he has the technical ability, but his tendencies are always to attack pretty much. And so it's mostly apologies for the dog.
No. One sec. Frequent viewers will know that I'm also having to go see my dog occasionally, but he's remarkably quiet at the moment.
Yeah, apologies for that.
That's all right. But, so essentially Cancelo's role has changed. So it's no longer a Cancelo type role in where it was the role where, right, you are in a fullback role, but you go and attack. Now it's you're in a fullback role, but no, go and help Rodri out. Cancelo can't do that, but Lewis can. Yeah. As a Cancelo owner at the moment, does that mean he's just now a bit part?
Yeah, I think the tricky thing is that we really don't know. That's the sort of messy thing at the moment. And so pretty much if Pep is to persist with this formation, there are a few options for Cancelo. One is what we saw against Chelsea in game week 19, where he can become one of those front 5 players. Right. He can play either wide right, wide left, and be one of those supporting players alongside Haaland, where he in that scenario he pretty much plays the same role that he was playing before, with just a little bit less defensive responsibility. So that's one thing for Cancelo that is definitely a possibility that I'm curious to see how much Pep plays around with that. You know, we saw him on the right against Chelsea, and I was a bit surprised by that because I expected him to move up to that front 5 area at some point, but I expected him to play off the left like he has done this season. So I think that's one option for him. Another option is in that back 3, Ake has really shined at that left center back spot. And Ake's been absolutely exceptional there. There's not really a reason for Pep to drop him at the moment. But long term, you look at the role that player plays, and if Cancelo can just sort of listen to these new instructions a bit more, that role is not so different to what he was playing earlier in the season, because Ake was getting forward quite a lot when he is playing that. And so there's certainly the potential for Cancelo to play either in the front 5 in this new system, at left center back, maybe even at right center back against a certain opponent. But at the moment, it really is a question of where does he fit in? You know, he seems too good of a player to just drop because Pep wants to play this new system. So it's more of just a waiting area to see where Pep fits him in, because you just reckon that eventually he will fit in somewhere. It's just we don't really know where. And if he is in that front 5 and becomes sort of a mainstay for even a part of the season, then he might even be a potentially better asset than he was before, because he's just attacking now. So,
sort of a tentative hold at the moment. Let's look at another player like
sorry, I let my dog back in.
Fine. Another before we look at game week 20. and your decisions there. And we talk a bit more about Man City. Another player, Foden, as well. Sit like Cancelo, nailed on every week. Suddenly he's not, and this happened before Christmas.
Hmm.
And there seemed to be no reason, and it was almost, and people were just speculating. Does he now hate him, or
Yeah.
did he not go to his birthday party, or so? I don't know. I mean, what were the reasons behind this, do you think?
Yeah, it's still sort of we don't really know that there were any quantitative reasons for it. There have been and Pep sort of argued this in his press conferences when he got asked about it, and he got quite mad about it because he said that there's always sort of these spells of time where a certain player will get benched more than they start for him.
Right.
And that's just sort of goes down to the depth that Pep has with the
Yeah.
squad. And he also attributed to body language, which
Yeah.
also makes sense to a degree because, Cancelo, I mean, not Cancelo, Foden plays off that left wing, and we've seen Pep play him at right wing before. He's played at false nine before Holland got there. He's played at that sort of left center mid spot where Gundogan typically occupies, or Bernardo in the cup games, but really in the Prem, he's a left winger. And Grealish is also just a left winger. And so every week, Pep is sort of faced with the dilemma of he has to start one of them and he has to bench one of them, unless he shifts Foden over to the right hand side. And I think that's just what happened for that run of games and sort of in the past few games since the restart, is that for one reason or another, whether it's tactics in particular games, whether it's Grealish is just looking better in training, whether he's just a bit happier, whether Pep just thinks he's a better fit at the moment. Pep just preferred Grealish at that moment to Foden. And, like you said earlier, anytime we watch Foden, he's amazing. Like, anytime I watch Foden play for City, it's like, how can you drop this guy?
Yeah.
But it really is, I just think, like, one of those tricky things that comes with the depth that City has, that at any moment a player besides Holland and KDB and Rodri, pretty much like any player could be dropped for one reason or another that we really don't know. And we can try to predict those things as much as we want, but sometimes there's just stuff we don't know in terms of Pep's judgment. So short answer, there really wasn't much of a reason for it besides rotation.
Okay. And so it looks like Mahrez could be the new Foden. I say that loosely in that he's the guy in favour. He seems to be the first name on the right wing. Is that right?
Yes and no. Yes, because he has been performing exceptionally. Mahrez is one of the players at City that is very sort of form based, I would say. It seems like he goes through a spell every season, typically around starting in January or February throughout the spring, especially in the Champions League most times, where Mahrez just hits an incredible run of form. And you just think, once again, how can Pep drop this type of guy?
Yeah.
And we're at that moment this season where Mahrez is doing that. And the tricky thing is that against certain opponents, particularly big teams like we have coming up this double game week, Pep will prefer to play both Bernardo and Gundogan in the same team.
Oh, okay.
And that's the big thing is for me is that, in that midfield, it's pretty consistent. You have Rodri holding, you have De Bruyne on the right side when he's fit, and then you have one of Gundogan or Bernardo on the left side. Gundogan's typically used against teams that sit back a bit more because he makes his late runs, and Bernardo's more against teams that play a bit more free-flowing transition because he has a bit more control in that midfield and his presence just offers a bit more, especially in terms of press resistance and whatnot. And like we saw against Chelsea, Bernardo is one of the only people alongside Rico Lewis who can drop into that double pivot with Rodri. So that's also a really important factor. And the thing with Mahrez for me is that as well as he's been playing recently, from a tactical perspective, Pep could always drop him and play Bernardo on that right side, just so that he has that extra presence in the midfield. I do think that Mahrez gets 1 out of 2 starts at least in this double game week, but just because he's been playing amazing doesn't mean that he's going to start every game for Pep now. And that's definitely something that people have to realize at the moment is that, the risk with going with Foden or with Mahrez is almost the same, is that they both have a counterpart to their position. Foden is Grealish, and for Mahrez, it's Bernardo. that at any given moment, for any tactical reason, Pep can drop them and play the other. And so it almost becomes a 50-50 decision with them. And in a double game week, it's both good and bad because, you sort of assume with either Foden and Mahrez, I have Foden in my team right now, you can just sort of put it off almost and think, okay, it's just a single game week for these guys. And that, you know, most of the time, if we play this double game week, let's say in a simulation, like over and over again, vast majority of the time, these guys are going to come out with one start out of two, probably around 90 minutes total combined with the two games. And so I think that's just the expectation that people should go into it with, is that with these fringe players who are around that 50 to 75% likelihood to start mark, you'll probably just get 1 out of 2 starts with them. If you're really lucky, you get 2 starts. If you're really unlucky, then you'll get 0 starts. But that's the game we play.
So it sounds like Ederson, De Bruyne, Haaland is probably the best triple up to have at the moment.
Definitely Haaland and De Bruyne, but I have an issue with Ederson personally in terms of FPL, is that you look at City in a vacuum, and Ederson is by far the most nailed player in the side after those two, or even before those two, because Ortega's not going to start in the Prem anytime soon. And, if we were to just pick 3 City players based on expected minutes and sort of ceiling of points, then yeah, Ederson would probably go into that triple up.
Yeah.
But then the tricky thing is that you just have to compare Ederson to all the other goalkeepers. And it doesn't really matter how good he is compared to City. It's that how good is he compared to the other goalkeepers. And so obviously with the 2 doubles coming up in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, he's probably one of the best picks out of the goalkeepers. But long term, without the doubles, he never really has that ceiling. Okay. He's normally a 6-point maximum player. We saw him get 8 points against Chelsea because it was a 1-0 game. But City don't normally play 1-0 games. We score 3 or 4 usually if we keep a clean sheet, and sometimes we don't keep a clean sheet, especially with our defensive record this season. So yes, Ederson is up there, but I do think that if we're just talking about like this double gaming in particular, for that third City spot, I would rather probably go with Foden or Mahrez over Ederson from a personal perspective, just because Ederson has he has a decently low floor, but his ceiling is also just so low. And when we're playing the likes of Man U and Spurs, I don't really see those as great clean sheet fixtures for us.
Okay. Well, let's have a look at game week 20, because we've talked about the fixtures. So I've got your team up on the screen for the benefit of those listening to on the podcast version. We've got Kepa in goal, Trippier, White, and Botman. De Bruyne, who's your vice captain, he's playing Manchester United and Tottenham. Fernandes, double fixture as well. Bruno there's got Manchester City, obviously, and then Crystal Palace. Foden, 2 fixtures, obviously. Rashford, 2 fixtures. Haaland, 2 fixtures. This is good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 double game week players. You've also got Wilson and Mitrovic, who play each other. Fulham and Newcastle. On the bench, you've got Ward, Bueno, Andreas, and Veltman. Also, just before we get your opinion about these players and what you're going to be doing as well, just a reminder to do press that like button and do subscribe as well. Do tell your friends to subscribe as well. It really helps us out and helps you to keep in touch with our videos and podcasts. Looking at this 3-4-3 at the moment, have you got 1 transfer, 2 transfers? What you plan to do?
1 transfer.
Okay.
Yeah, I have 1 transfer and 1.6 million in the bank, I believe.
So what do you plan to do with this?
The plan at the moment that I don't really see changing is just to make the obvious move, as most would think, and bring Luke Shaw in, most likely for Hugo Bueno as my defender, because I have Trippier, White, and Botman, none of whom I want to get rid of in the long term, so they're sort of staying in my team.
Yeah.
And then I have Veltman as my 4th defender because of Brighton's potential double or triple game week in 21, or upcoming at some point or another. And so Bueno is just sort of that last defender that I don't mind shifting on, and I have the funds to move him to Shaw. And, Spurs assets are the other potential move to make, but I would have to make a double move to get to Kane, and even then, with that -4, I don't have a very obvious
No.
route to him in terms of dropping one of my other double game week guys, which doesn't make much sense to me. So my plan is just to bring in Luke Shaw for Bueno and then start him over either Mitrovic or White, depending on how I'm feeling based on Arsenal's clean sheet chances and based on if I want to hedge my bets with Mitrovic against my double Newcastle defense.
Okay, so I mean, if someone's looking at this fresh, I mean, you've mentioned about you favour an attacker over an Ederson, for example. So in terms of the best three Man City assets, who are the best three Man City assets? De Bruyne, Haaland, I would imagine, are two of yours. Who's the third?
Yeah, so just for this game week in particular, for double game week 20, obviously Haaland and De Bruyne have to be there. Obviously, everyone has Haaland at this point. If you don't have De Bruyne, I would say that he's, that highest priority transfer along with the likes of Kane.
Yeah.
If you don't have either of them, then it's a decision for which one to go with if you can't get both of them. But De Bruyne is definitely that second guy. And then it's really difficult at the moment to come up with a third City asset because sort of in this stage of the season previously, there was a tweet from FPL Schadenfreude that I saw this morning that took us back to double game week 19 in the 2021 season when Stones scored 27 points and Diaz scored 18.
Yes.
And I owned both of them in that game week.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
That shot me up the ranks real quick.
Yeah.
Normally around this period, double City defense is almost the move because our defense tightens up, other defenses get a bit looser. We have double game weeks that come in, and it's just sort of you put them in your team, you don't really have to worry about it. Maybe they'll start, maybe they'll get benched 1 out of every 4 games, but you just sort of put in the most nailed guys, quote unquote, and just be happy with it, and the points will come. This season, it's a lot different for a few reasons. One is that our defense is performing a bit below average for what we're used to from a City team. The second is that you look at the fixtures in double gaming 20 and double gaming 23, and they're just not great defensive fixtures. I don't normally expect us to keep a clean sheet away to United. I don't really expect us to keep a clean sheet at home to Spurs. In 23, I expect us to keep a clean sheet against Villa, but I don't expect us to keep a clean sheet against Arsenal. And so for defenders and for Ederson, there's really no clear pick, even before we take a look at the minutes, because just the prospects of keeping a clean sheet is not so high that the ceiling of getting that, Stones 27-pointer or whatnot just really doesn't seem to be there. And so when I sort of make that assessment, my mind just then goes to, okay, I think the third best City asset is probably an attacker. And that's what leads me to Foden and Mahrez as that third City player, is because yes, they'll probably only start 1 of 2, but if you're guaranteed a City player to start 1 game in any game week, even if you have a full team of double game week players around them, you probably still want them in your team. They're just, the ceiling is there, the floor is supposedly there. Obviously, you can still get unlucky and have them be benched 2 out of 2, but the odds of that are so low that I think you take the risk there. And yeah, and I think we can talk about Rico Lewis too, but
yeah, I mean, because for example, I'm a Cancelo owner, and I say that not just selfishly trying to get advice on my team, because so many people aren't. So many people have got rid of him as well. We many of us started with Cancelo, after the World Cup. Is it worth keeping him? I'm with this problem myself. Is it worth just keeping him and hoping he starts at least once?
Yeah, and so obviously I say that Foden and Mahrez are that third pick for me, but at the same time, that's only just saying straight up, if we could make a scout team, who would I pick as the 3 City players?
Yeah.
And it becomes much different when we talk about transfers and what moves to make. And so for the people with Cancelo, for the people with even Stones and Akanji, and I know some people had them from the restart, even people who have Walker, I would pretty much just hold whatever third City asset you have. I would mostly just hold. The only thing that I like in terms of dropping, let's say, Cancelo down to Rico Lewis, is if it's the only reasonable way that you can get funds to move up to Kane, for example, or get the funds to move. Let's say someone has Haaland, Foden, Cancelo at the moment. If you want to move Foden to De Bruyne and you need the funds somewhere for whoever has that scenario, dropping Cancelo down to Lewis like makes sense in that scenario for me. But if someone just has one transfer, let's say, and is thinking, oh, I don't want to hold Cancelo anymore. This has been too painful.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to go through this anymore. I don't like just that drop down to Lewis because, and I'll pull up my tentative starting odds
Yeah. Okay.
at
Yeah.
the
Yeah. What
moment
is
for the
it?
double game week.
Exclusive is this?
Yeah, so I'll put my starting odds out on Twitter tomorrow,
Okay.
and then I'll have my lineup predictions out the morning of the deadline. Um, but at the moment, I have Walker, surprisingly to many, as the defender outside of Ederson, obviously, with the
Okay.
highest chance to start.
Okay.
And the reason for that is upon the restart when we were all making our Game Week 17 wildcards, I was getting all these questions about who's the best City defender if we don't want Cancelo. And I went without Cancelo personally, just because I saw value elsewhere. And my response was that Stones is best for the short term and Akanji is best for the long term. And I still do think, I mean, the short term for Stones has passed. It was more the 3 game weeks that we just went through. But what I said about Walker for people that were on him is that at this point in his career, as good as Walker has been historically, Walker is now pretty much a piece in Pep's squad where he's utilized whenever we play a great team that has a really, really good left winger, especially.
Okay.
And so in this double game week, we're playing Man United, who have Rashford on the left, or maybe he'll play in the center, who knows? But Rashford, and when we play Spurs, they have Son. And so just look at those games, and from a tactical perspective, it just makes sense that Pep will want Walker to play against those guys to counter them. You know, it's almost 100% in my mind that Walker gets 1 out of 2 starts. And it's very likely, I have it at about just over 50% odds right now that Walker will start 2 out of 2 games.
Okay. So, but Walker is, from an FPL point of view, that's just half the story with Walker, because of course he doesn't have a lot of other attributes to him. So you're looking at, if you hope to get a clean sheet and 6 points, but that's probably what you're after with him. But nevertheless,
exactly.
he does in your view, and I think many other people would think that as well, that a good chance of starting at least one.
Yeah, and then in terms of the other defenders, Cancelo and Laporte are in the next bracket. You know, even though Cancelo's been shifted around and sort of out of the squad in a way, I do think that sort of just from, I don't really know what to call this, but I don't think that Pep throws Rico Lewis into a derby away at Old Trafford. I just think that there's sort of some intangible there that, do you really want to, as good as he's been, do you really want to put in an 18-year-old? Yeah.
I could scar him for life.
Pretty much, yeah. So I don't know. I just think that it makes sense in my mind that Pep will revert to almost what we saw the first time when we beat Man U 6-3 was the backline was Cancelo, Diaz, Stones, Walker. And obviously Diaz is out injured right now, but I think we pretty much see a return to that or something similar where Cancelo comes back in. Maybe we transition back to the old formation. Maybe Bernardo plays that DM role alongside Rodri. But it just seems like a game where we sort of return to that backline. And then against Spurs, sort of the inverse of that. I think that's a game where this new 3-2 anti-counter structure is really well utilized. And I fully expect Lewis to come back into that in the Spurs game. Play there, because I just think that against the counter threat of Spurs, the way that Conte sets them up, I just think it makes sense to have that system there. And especially with a home game, there's not as much pressure on Rico, and you can still play Walker as the right center back there, and he can handle Son and whatnot. So that's sort of the thinking there. And in terms of the odds, like Cancelo and Laporte are sort of the next tier below Walker, and then Stones, Akanji, and Ake are all pretty much the same below them. And so there really isn't a clear defensive option. And like you say with Walker, there's not really another route to points there. So it just becomes really tricky trying to pick out one. And when people ask me about moving from one to the other, that's why my response is just pretty much just hold whichever one you have unless it enables a move elsewhere.
And across the midfield, De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva, and attacking role, Grealish, Foden. Which one will get the nod, do you think? Mahrez?
Yeah, so I
We've already
fully
spoken
expect,
about Mahrez probably,
yeah,
possibly in doubt.
yeah, in terms of the odds, obviously Holland, KDB, and Bernardo, I pretty much expect to start both. Bernardo, the least likely out of those three. Rodri, obviously, as well, although he's not an FPL option. And then with Foden, Mahrez, Gundogan, even Grealish, and Alvarez, um, Foden, Mahrez, Gundogan, and Grealish are all fairly similar in the odds for me. Um, Sort of with the tactical idea that I was just talking about against Spurs, against a team that sits deep like that. Pep has seemed to favor Grealish on the left and Mahrez on the right. Uh, for whatever reason, because they sort of drag their men wide, they can play as wide as possible, take men on when they isolate themselves there. Whatever the reason is, it's sort of a pattern that's come up this season against these low blocks. Grealish on the left, Mahrez on the right, even though it's still sort of like 60-40 for both of them. It just tilts the scale a little bit. But so that's sort of what I expect in that Spurs game. And then against Man U, it's a bit bigger of a question mark as to how Pep sets up, because especially when he plays against these managers like Ten Hag, like these sort of tactical mastermind managers, Pep likes to try to outsmart them in a way, or he either tries to outsmart them, or he either tries to say like, screw you, I don't care what you're going to do. I'm just going to play my game and put the best team out there. And that's what we saw last time at Old Trafford, and or when we played at the Etihad, and Foden and Holland both got their hat tricks. And so it's a bit trickier for me in terms of like guessing that, but if I had to guess at the moment, and this will probably be how my prediction falls when I release the starting 11 predictions, that I expect a wing pairing of Foden and Bernardo against Man United, but then I expect Grealish and Mahrez to play against Spurs.
Okay.
And so I definitely expect sort of like a 1-in-1 slot for each
that's
of
going
them.
to give a lot of people who are thinking of investing in Man City's midfield something to think about there.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're going to get a game, and that single game could get you more points than 2 games from, say, Edison, or indeed Walker if he does play twice. Just before we go elsewhere with your team, you got any sort of long-term plans with this? I mean, there's no Liverpool, for example, at the moment. You're quite happy with that? And what else do you think? Are you just waiting for sort of more double game week announcements?
Yeah, I mean the plan from here on out is pretty much just to roll transfers and use them to bring in double game week players. I mean it's always fairly straightforward at this point in the season in my mind, and that's why I sort of like this and succeed in this period, is I get to sort of take my hands off, like just not think about certain things for a little bit and just bring in sort of the obvious moves, and in the long term they go well. One thing that I do want to do before we got the double game week announcement for Man United, the plan had been to bring in Saka for Bruno eventually. I really want Saka back in, or Odegaard.
Yeah.
Especially I want one or both of them long term. That's sort of the main plan for me. And then aside from that, pretty much just playing the doubles as they come. On my game week 17 wild card, I was picking between, because I was sort of set on Bruno without Ronaldo, of like, oh, he's going to go back to just the hopefulness that he would return to that sort of main man role, which he hasn't. But I was set on that, and so the decision became, who do I go for between Foden and Saka for a few weeks before I bring the other one in for Bruno? And silly enough, of course, I went for Foden, who performed so much worse than Saka over that period, but so it goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. That's something for my team as well. I'm looking at Odegaard or Saka long term. I think they're great options there. Hey, Alex, thanks so much for joining me. Good luck with Game Week 20. Good luck with the rest of the season. Good luck predicting Pep this week and beyond. We've got your Twitter handle up on screen at 4lex_MCFC. For those listening on the podcast, do check out Alex's Twitter account there. Listen out for his future podcasts as well, because it's packed full of really good information there, through Emma Jump the Waves collection of experts looking at trying to predict Pep, predict Conte, predict Potter, which is that must be that. Well, I'll tell you what, that'll be a long show for another time for whoever's brave enough to do that. And but yeah, thanks a lot for your time, Alex, and good luck. And pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.